Nothing like 400 people watching you watch TV. Welcome in. If you don't know me, my name is Jason. I'm the Next Gen pastor here. And I can officially now welcome you to Christmas. Like, we made it. Okay, so that tells me where the room is at, right? So like my family and I are completely gone on this, right? Like we were like November 1st, pumpkin in the trash, candy cane up on the door frame. Like we decorate right away. And I don't know if you noticed, but apparently our special events team has a similar skill set. If you walked in today, this place is like a gingerbread wonderland. If you're on VR or YouTube, I assume your house looks different, although we had nothing to do with it. But I want to give a special shout out to our special events team as they set us up into these incredible things. Can we give it up for them? Now, almost to a T, none of them like public recognition. They're all backstage people, so that's all we're going to do for them. No, I'm kidding. Like, they've been here so much over the last few weeks. They've been here probably more than some of our staff have. But it's all so that you can enjoy Christmas and celebrate with your families. We actually already had families come in and start taking their family photos for Christmas in front of that gingerbread house out there. So massive thanks to them. We got this star that I've been assured will not kill me, hanging on the ceiling. That's incredible by our tech team. Here's what's awesome about Christmas. It doesn't matter where we come from, we are tied together by Christmas. We all have stories, we all have memories, right? Whether it's that macaroni ornament from '92 that's somehow still hanging on, toxic glue back then or something, whether it's a favorite song or a favorite movie, like we all have things that tie us together, and those are the stories that we actually end up sharing. So I want to give you a chance. In VR, you can turn to somebody on the line. You can do the chat in the room. I just want you to turn to somebody and have 20 seconds here to share your favorite thing or your favorite memory about Christmas. And I'm serious. Like, go. All right. It's enough. Merry Christmas, filthy animals. Let's stop. All right, so that was veiled. Only a few people got it. So here's what I love about Christmas, right? Even if you're sharing with somebody that's not in your family and they weren't there for that story, they kind of get it right away, right? Like my favorite story growing up, actually my wife and I were dating, we were just almost engaged, and she was at Christmas with my family. And we were sitting at my mom's house with my brother and sister who are much younger than me, and my brother had been whining at a 13-year-old for like 8 months about wanting a guitar. Right? In the back of the corner of the tree was a guitar-shaped package. There's only so much you can do with a guitar. And my mom just mailed it in. She just like wrapped the paper around it, right? And like he was getting disappointed. And with as much excitement as a 13-year-old will allow himself to show, he dove for that guitar the second he saw it, which actually then made our Christmas tree dive in the exact opposite direction with the exact same amount of energy onto my girlfriend, who is now my wife. Right, I'm talking about like the ornaments falling on her head, the lights around her neck, the tinsel, like probably giving her blindness. Like, I mean, like the whole thing went. And after we were sure that A, the guitar was okay, and then B, Ashton was okay, like we actually sat back and I went, you know what? Like we laughed, we had a good time. And it was a big thing of me being like, okay, like this is family. Like this can work. Right? So here's what's funny is I can share that story and you all weren't even in Illinois when that happened most likely. And yet, you're all with me. It all makes sense. Well, here's what's interesting. The Jewish people back in Jesus' day had similar stories about Christmas. They just didn't know it was Christmas yet. They had prophecies and predictions about their coming king. And in the same way, they could share them as families and as communities, and they would actually feel connected by the promises of their king that is yet to come. Now, they had to wait way longer than we do to get to it. Right? I mean, I know some adults that can't wait 11 months for next Christmas. Hello. But the Jewish people, the predictions about Jesus, about their king, about their Messiah, actually started about 700 or 800 years before Jesus' birth. And they would hang on to these promises, and they would sit there, and they would cling to them, and they would find identity with them, and hope with them, and memories with them. The same way that we find memory in tinsel and Mariah Carey and movies. But here's what's true. Jesus coming for them was a big piece of who they were. It's a big piece of who we are. So as we spend the next 3 weeks kind of like getting ready for Christmas, we're actually going to be looking at those prophecies, those predictions, and seeing what they said about the people then, about Jesus coming later, and about the heart of God for us today, because every one of those prophecies actually ties together those three strands like a nice little candy cane. That didn't happen at 9 o'clock. That's new. A nice little candy cane tells us about God then, about Jesus' coming, and about who we are today. But here's what's fascinating. In the Old Testament, there are roughly 300 predictions about the coming king. Like, that's a crazy amount. You can't predict the next 300 things I'm going to do, period, much less get them right from 800 years away. So I started trying to wrap my head around, like, what does 300 right predictions look like? I couldn't get there. So then I thought, okay, let's get simple, because there's this 48 kind of major prophecies about the Messiah. So let's lower the bar. Let's look for 48 of them. Now, I found a number that is like 1 in the blank power, but I went to public school, so that doesn't make sense to me either. Like, I don't have math skills. So then I started looking like, what's the likelihood? And I found it. Are you ready for this? The likelihood that one man could fulfill just 48 of those major prophecies in one lifetime is roughly the same as winning the lottery 22 consecutive times. So 22 weeks in a row. I mean, like, let's just unpack that for a second. Can you imagine the audacity of like one of your friends being like, all right, I'm going to walk in today, going to win the lottery, and getting it right? Like that's like mind-breaking enough. But then you're like, man, congratulations. What are you going to do with the prize? I'm going to go in next week and do it again. Sure you are. Then they pull it off. For 20 more weeks, they pull it off time and time again. Like, that is the likelihood that one man in one lifetime could fill all those prophecies. But here's what's funny. The Old Testament writers didn't know each other. They weren't sitting there working together to craft a narrative of a coming Messiah. They wrote over 700 years spread across from one another. It's almost like God showing off. And he's saying, by the way, this is what's going to happen, and you're going to know it's my son by the fingerprint that I'm leaving with these prophecies. Through this fingerprint, you'll know he's mine. So we're going to spend the next couple weeks looking at just a few of those prophecies and looking at the fingerprint of God, declaring that Jesus was his son and the hope that would come from him for Israel and for us today. But today we're actually going to start with the prophecies that came before Jesus was even born about his family. Right? We're going to look at Jesus' family before he was even on the scene, which that was what those video was all about. It had a couple of those verses in there, but let's look at this one. One of the major verses is Isaiah 9:6, where it says this: "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time forever." Forever. Okay. Sometimes it's hard to talk. So, establishing it with justice and righteousness from that time forever. This is one of the major prophecies that come out that was declaring that the Messiah, the king, would come through the line of David, through the family tree of a guy named King David. And King David was this massive figure in the Old Testament, in the Israel faith, right? He was their second king after King Saul, but he was the biggest king of them all, right? He was a shepherd turned king. He was a musician. He was a man after God's heart. He had all these things going from him. And you can just imagine that every generation of David's line, the Jewish people would have just been sitting there like, all right, is this the one? No, that guy kind of sucks. All right, this one? No, he messed up too. Okay, this one? Like, they just would have been waiting, right? But through that line of David eventually comes the king that would save all of mankind. Now, for us to understand this reign and this king thing, it almost doesn't make sense in our DNA because we know very little about royalty and kings. I mean, right? I mean, like in American democracy, we're used to everything changing every 820 years. Like, it takes time, but eventually all the faces change. They're not related, mostly. And then, after a little bit of time, we get something new. But back in that day, qualifications were second, family line was first. The family line was the most important thing. The closest we get today is the royal family over in the UK, right? Which just made like half of you lean in. I don't get it. I want to be intelligent, but I don't understand this fascination with the royal family. They're there, they're not here, right? But yet, we all, as a world, We get so entrenched in this family over there, right? Whether it's Queen Elizabeth and her like 175-year-old life, and then the corgis, the little dumb dogs, like that have a royal bloodline of their own, right? All those corgis descended from the first corgi that was hers when she was like 12. I know this because I Googled it. And then I asked my wife. She's really into this, just like the rest of you kind people. Then you could look at that. Then you can look at Princess Diana in the 90s, right? And all the great work she did and the unfortunate passing she had. But the mourning that fell over our world when that happened, like that was real. I was a kid, but I remember it. Or you can look at, hold on, I gotta check this one. Yeah, there's a lot of names. Kate and William's wedding, right? Back in 2011 was this big thing for the world, right? It was actually watched by 162 million people live across the world. And it was like 4 a.m. here in the US, right? And yet, everybody was so enthralled by this family. They were so interested in this family. And the Jewish people would have felt the same way about the line of David. So enthralled, so leaned in, so excited to see what came next. So eventually what happens is between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's about 400 years of silence where the prophets just stopped speaking and Jesus wasn't on the scene yet. But yet the first line in the very first book we have in the New Testament is by a guy named Matthew. And he goes out of his way at the beginning to point us from Jesus back to David, to show us that these prophecies, these fingerprints were fulfilled by the coming of Jesus. Now, these things in the Bible are actually called genealogies. They're kind of family trees or the pages you might skip. But what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at Matthew 1. And we're going to see that Matthew went out of his way to link 42 generations from Abraham all the way to Jesus to show us that he belonged in that line. Now, before you get worried, we're not covering all 42. That'd be nuts. I can't even say half their names. But what we're going to do instead is look at 4 generations of this family tree that I think show us so much about God's heart for his people, that Jesus was coming, and his heart for us today. 4 generations that show us what God is really up to, right? So, starting in Matthew 1, verses 1 and 2, we start right away with the very first words recorded in the New Testament. Say, this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. So, right off the bat, we're honestly starting strong. Abraham was a high character guy found in the beginning parts of Genesis. Eventually, God walks forward and he says, listen, I want to make a deal with you, a covenant, a promise. And if you agree to follow me, then I'm going to give you certain things. God basically says, I will be your Lord, and in return, I will give you land and a legacy. I'll give you a promised land of people yet to come, and of land yet to come, and I'll give you people in a way where your descendants will outnumber the stars in the sky and the sand in the ground. And Abraham says yes, and lives a life following God. Eventually, he actually has 2 twins right away, and they're called Jacob and Esau. Flip that, Esau and Jacob, because Esau came out first, right? Esau and Jacob were the first descendants of Abraham. Now, what happens in that day was the firstborn son got all the birthrights. It was like dibs. They got dibs on all the good stuff, and then all the siblings. Actually, that's kind of how it works today, too. You get all the dibs on the good stuff, and then later on, you got the rest of the stuff down to the other kids. Jacob wasn't happy with that. So Jacob actually concocted with his mom a plan to steal Esau's birthright. So one day, way in the back of Abraham's life, when his eyesight is failing, Jacob actually cooks his favorite stew. He brings it in. He puts fur on his hand like Elmo because Esau was very hairy. So he comes in and he actually, multiple times in Genesis 27, declares, I am the oldest son, I am your oldest son. He's lying over and over again. Eventually, Abraham says, well, okay, I can't see anyway. So he passes along the dibs, the promised birthright that was meant for Esau, but he gives it to Jacob instead. I mean, look at this promise, and look how powerful it is. This is meant for Esau, spoken to Jacob by Abraham. Jacob steals this. He says, may nations serve you, and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. Heesh. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. This was meant for Esau, stolen by Jacob. And yet we see Jacob in the family line of Jesus. That's interesting to me. Eventually, Esau finds out that his birthright was stolen and it breaks the relationship. Shocking. But what we see is we're 2 generations toward Jesus, and we've now picked up a thief who steals from his family. Like, we are off to a fantastic start. Right, so we roll forward. Just a couple verses later, we see next in Matthew 1:5, a few generations that are highlighted in one verse. It says this, that, okay, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know how to say this name. It looks like salmon, but that can't be it. But he's not here. So, Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse. To us, this is so easy to breeze over, but it is worth stopping and bringing attention to this fact. The very first worldview, the very first religion that saw men and women as equals was Christianity. The very first religion that declared and put on paper that they should be treated and esteemed the same way was Christianity. And it starts right away in this genealogy because culturally, there was no reason to include the women. It's just a thing they didn't do, right? Much like how our last names typically come from the father's side. That's just this like long-lasting kernel of this view back then. That the only way to tie family trees together was through the dad. So there's no cultural reason to include these women. And yet, Matthew goes out of the way to include not just 2, but actually 4 in the genealogy of Jesus. He goes out of his way to say we need to view the women and their contributions to this line with the exact same weight as we do the men. I just think that's worth noting. So back to Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So in Joshua, in the Old Testament, we see the people of Israel taking the promised land that had been promised to Abraham before. They were finally going to come into possession of that promise of land. And what happens is they're worried, they're nervous about taking it over and conquering it. So Joshua sends out 2 spies whose names were Caleb and Phinehas. Weird. So he sends out Caleb and Phinehas to actually go out and decide if the land was able to be taken at all. While they're in Jericho, kind of scouting out and kind of bringing back the scouting report about the land, the king of Jericho finds out there are 2 enemy spies inside the city, scouting them out. So he sends out his army on a hunt to find and kill the spies. And Caleb and Phinehas actually end up hiding in the house of Rahab. It's kind of an interesting, like, goose chase thing, but look at the first way that the Bible introduces Rahab. It actually says this. It describes as this in Joshua. It says, the 2 men set out and came to the house of the prostitute named Rahab and stayed the night there. That's quite the introduction. Right, so we're 10 generations now into Jesus' line, and we have picked up a thief who cheats his family and a prostitute. Right, we're on a great roll, but look at what Rahab does. While the spies were in hiding in Rahab's house, she actually protects them. It's not just like she took a booking fee for a hotel and like put them in room 107 and locked the door. No, the guards come to her house. And they actually interrogate her and quiz her, and she actually lies to protect these spies of Israel, the people of God. She puts her neck out there in a way that just doesn't make sense. Then after the guards go, and it's peaceful, we actually have this conversation recorded between Caleb, Phinehas, and Rahab, where it says this in Joshua 2:9. Rahab says, I know the Lord has given you this land, she told them. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will be kind to me and my family, since I have helped you. Rahab, who's introduced only by her occupation of prostitute, actually saves these spies. And you actually see in this moment, she had incredible faith to say, I know your God is the actual God. Please deliver me and save me. Now, it doesn't make sense. Rahab is the enemy. She's living in the city about to be invaded. But she says, I see your God. I believe in your God. Your God will deliver me through your hands. That's such incredible faith that it actually grafts her in as an outsider into the family tree of Jesus. Eventually, she marries Salmon, and she actually becomes part of the Jewish lineage. Then we go forward. In Matthew 1:5 again, it says this right after, that Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Again, esteeming women as equal to men. And what we see in this moment actually in Ruth is this whole Old Testament book named Ruth. Super interesting. Ruth is actually in there. It's the whole story of what happened. She's married to another guy. He passes away, so she moves to Bethlehem as we start to get back towards Jesus in the predictions. She actually moves to Bethlehem, and she actually comes with her mother-in-law, because if anybody wants to hang out with a widow, it's the mother-in-law. Right, so eventually they sit down, and they actually get discovered by a guy named Boaz. They had nothing. They were a widowed illegal immigrant coming into a land they didn't belong to. They're outsiders. And yet Boaz actually shows the heart of God by seeing Ruth's need, leaning out of his way to match it and provide for her. Ultimately marrying her and having kids, as we see, as we look forward. Obed was one of their kids. So in our stop now, we picked up a prostitute and a widow immigrant along with the cheater. I said we're doing 4 generations. So let's see how fun it can get now. All right. 4th generation in Matthew 1:6. It says this, that Jesse was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Now we're finally to the man of the hour. King David, the shepherd turned king, the musician, the beautiful heart, the heart after God's own God, the author of so much of the Psalms in the Bible. Like, we're finally arrived, the man who will eventually pass on this throne, right? But 4 words in that verse actually kind of mess us up here. It's at the very end where it's describing Solomon, right? David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Now, we can go fast through that, or we can realize that this is a scandal moment, right? Because Uriah and Bathsheba were married. David is the 27th great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus, and yet there's this one line. So Uriah and Bathsheba were married. They were living life happily in the kingdom. Uriah was a soldier, and what happened was one day David was on top of his palace, and he looks out across Jerusalem and he sees Bathsheba, and instantly he falls in lust, and he goes to her and actually ends up kingly swooping her up her feet, and they actually have an affair. She ends up pregnant. Now in this moment, David finds out, and he freaks out, and he decides what to do. He actually brings Uriah back from battle for a little bit. That plan doesn't work, so instead he puts him back into battle right at the front line, knowing that it would kill him. After Uriah is put to death, Bathsheba and David get married. They end up having Solomon, which restarts the line. So, the man after God's own heart, the shepherd turned king, the musician, was also a king who was an adulterer, a manipulator, self-serving, and murderer. 4 generations of this line we've picked up, just as a fun refresher. We've picked up a thief who cheats his family, a prostitute, an illegal immigrant, and a king that is only out for his own good. And you all thought your Thanksgiving was fun. Right? This is the family that Jesus comes from. Now, these are not the people that we would imagine the eternal Savior coming from. If we would concoct it in a lab, these are not the people that we would go, oh man, that's the one, let's pick the killer. Right? No, we wouldn't. These are the stories we hide. These are the people that we actually go out of our way to maybe not include in the stories. Maybe these are the people that we actually, go out of our way to have their invitation lost in the mail for every major family moment, right? And yet, Matthew is not remotely embarrassed or slow to put them on the front page of his account. Matthew doesn't hide them. Matthew doesn't bury them. Instead, Matthew declares that this is who the king came from. I think there's something so powerful in that. Because you think about our obsession with the royals over time. They've only been on the throne since 1602. And yet we're enthralled by them. A lot of people think about them every day. I don't get it, but they do. They think about their royalty every day. Their royalty thinks nothing about them. And yet, here we are, a broken mess. And our eternal royalty is endlessly enthralled with every piece of us. As a matter of fact, God was so distraught at the idea that his creation was broken that he sent his son to actually give us a way out, to give us freedom. And he didn't send him as a sovereign king to call the shots. No, he actually sent him as one of us. There's this translation of John 1 that I love where it says, "For God put on flesh and moved into the neighborhood and made his home among us." God's not shocked by our struggles. Jesus isn't shocked by our struggles. He comes from them. Which is why I think our big idea that we have to grasp onto in Matthew 1 as we look at the foretellings of Jesus is really this, that the king finds his home in the broken. That the king finds his home in the broken. And he's connected to his creation in such a way that he came as one of us, lived a full life, and suffered death even though he didn't earn any of it. The king doesn't avoid the broken, doesn't skip the broken, doesn't throw away the broken. No, our king finds his home in the shattered pieces of humanity, which I don't know about you. That's so good for me because I am extremely broken. It almost doesn't even make sense that this is how God would orchestrate this. As a matter of fact, like we look at our family of origin and we look at the broken pieces and we want to fix them or ditch them, right? Over time, there's been such good work done on we have to understand our family of origin to have a future, to be able to be healthy in the future, to move forward in the future. But I got to tell you guys, the king says otherwise. The king says, that's broken, let me take a shot. And this is what happens. I've seen this over years where I've heard adults and teenagers declare the same destiny just because their family of origin started that way. I've heard us too often give too much weight and too much voice to our family of origin and their struggles in our story. You need to hear this. A lot of you need to hear this for the first time. Your family did not decide the last chapter just because they wrote the first chapter. Your future destination isn't finished just because of where you started. Where you started is a portion, but it's not the end, right? And I've heard this from teenagers and adults the same. My parents were divorced, I'm just going to be divorced anyway. I've heard them say, adults and teenagers alike, I've heard them say that, my family's always broke, so I'm going to be poor, so why try? I've heard them say that me and my siblings never got along, so why would we start trying now anyway that we're grown? We believe that we're stuck in motion, that we're stuck and we can't get better. But the king came amongst the broken to give us a shot out. And again, if the king came from a cheater, prostitute, immigrant, and king murderer, y'all, you're good. I bet most of you haven't done those things, especially the king killer part. But this is the big moment. As I prepped this week with Josh and Lisa being gone, I got ready, and I couldn't honestly get my handle around this thing until I realized this. That some of you, I don't know who, were given an ankle weight instead of a head start from your family. Some of you were given weights that have held you back and down. Some of you have been given head starts, and that's worth celebrating. That's incredible that your families gave you that. But here was the moment that just got me when God showed it to me. The truth is that every single one of you are someone else's next generation. Right? Every single one of you has a spot right now in the family tree. It doesn't matter what you came from, it only matters where you're growing towards. Because we look at it and we see that Jacob, Rahab, Ruth, David had terrible stories, and yet here they are, front and center, representing the king. Our stories can be the same. And we can use our head start and celebrate it and move forward, or we can get rid of our weights and run forward. Either way, we're all in the same boat, and we all need to do two things as we get ready to deal and get ready to be a great representation of the family tree of God. We need to do two things, right? Number one, we need to learn how to break the chains. Break the chains that surround you. There's this image when I was preparing this of chains that fascinates me. Because chains can do so many things, right? You got those big old ones that can chain a road constructor to a semi and it doesn't fall off. That blows my mind, right? They're massive and they hold on to that. Then you also have chains that tie padlocks together, chains that you can wear if you can pull off a gold chain, which I cannot, right? All these different chains do all these different things. But here's what's interesting about all of them. They're all only one link away from breaking. The family chains that you might have been given or that you might have picked up in your own life anyway. Let's be honest, it's not always them, sometimes it's us. The family chains and weights that you have picked up are all only one link from being broken. And you are that link. You can break the chain and set free for something new. That's the whole reason why Christ came. Is so that we wouldn't be stuck to our past or our family's past anymore. We can be all about the future. The chains can break and fall off. I think that's why Paul put it this way in Galatians 5:1. He says this, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery." You've been set free. Stand firm. Do not be re-chained to the weight of your slavery. Instead, live with freedom. right? Begin to realize that yes, your family let anger loose at home. Yes, they had money problems. Yes, they introduced poor influences. Whatever it was, yes, it definitely happened. But that doesn't mean it has to still happen. We can break those chains and we can turn to Christ and be set free from those things. Do you know that each of those spotlighted generations, you know what each one of them did? Eventually they broke the chain. That's why they're in this line of Jesus, is eventually every one of those generations broke the chains that surrounded them. Jacob went out of his way to actually receive forgiveness from Esau later in Genesis. The man who stole from his family actually went back and got forgiveness from his family. Rahab believed and turned away from her old lifestyle. And in Hebrews 11 in the New Testament is actually mentioned not just by name and position and job. She's not mentioned just by that. She's mentioned as a hero of the faith because of her bold faith that broke the chain. Ruth married into the nation of Israel and actually introduced an outsider heritage, showing that the Savior wasn't just for Israel, he was for us. And then David actually sought forgiveness from God from the affair. He leads Israel for years and becomes the generational monarch that leads to Jesus. Now, they all could have stayed broken, but instead they unshackled the chains and chased something new by turning to God. For some of you, that's going to be the challenge today, is to break the chain and chase after something from God. For some of you, maybe the chains are broken or they're small. Let's be honest, you still got them. They need to break, they're small. But what do we do after breaking the chain? Well, then we get the privilege of starting something new. Once we break the chain, we get the privilege of starting something new and making sure that our spot in the family tree is healthy. Right? Ephesians 4, Paul put it this way in this letter. He says, since now you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off your old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. Now wait a second. The line of David in Isaiah was predicted to be never-ending, peaceful, and holy. And here we are later with the Apostle Paul saying, throw off the old self. Let the Spirit, let your relationship with God transform your mind so that you can become like you were created to be, truly righteous and holy. It's the promise being fulfilled with each one of us who comes into relationship with Jesus and lets him call the shots in our life. Now, this is a big deal in my family because we come from the broken, just like the King came to save. And we look at both of our families, my wife's family, my family, and this was actually a common phrase back when we first got married. We would actually say to each other that we were actually going to start a new breed of Etchison, which is my last name in case you didn't catch that. We sat out, and even on our honeymoon, we're like, all right, new breed of Etchison, new breed of Etchison. We knew that maybe my in-laws gave us some stuff, my parents gave us some stuff, but we didn't want all the stuff. Not just literally, although we didn't want that either, but we didn't want all the baggage that they'd given us, all the chains that come with it. So we sat down and we asked ourselves, okay, so like both of our families struggled with money. All right, then like what does God want us to do with money? What's the new breed of Etchison going to do with money? Both of our families struggled with relationships and not being able to forgive and heal. Okay, well then what does God say about what the new breed of Etchison should do to forgive and heal? And we ask ourselves things like, okay, both of our families struggled with anxiety and self-doubt and depression. Okay, what does the new breed of Etchison do with those things? And each time we ask ourselves, what would this new version of us do, this new version of our family do, we would actually look at kind of three places. We would look at both of our families, yes. We would look at the people around us that God had given us. And most importantly, we would look to God himself. We would say, okay, the people around us that we respect in the church and the community of God say this. What does God actually say? And after years of doing this, I can finally say that the new breed of Etchison is here. I watch my kids and they don't have the same chains around them that we started with ours. Now, granted, we're going to give them their own, but they don't have the ones that we were responsible for breaking. For the last 13 years, we've been creating something new. But it all started in one instant where we decided we weren't going to be chained by the past anymore, and instead we were going to chase something new. I don't know what your family of origin gave you. I don't know. But I do know that the King finds his home in the broken. And I do know that it doesn't matter how young or how old you are, he's ready to get to work again. He comes from us, he understands us, and he came so that he can heal us. That's what the prophecies about the King of David, the lineage of David, actually mean. That the coming Messiah, the Savior of the world, would completely understand his creation. And there would be nothing beyond what he could fix. Break chains. Start something new. You're only one link away from being free. Would you guys pray with me? Lord, all these promises, all these prophecies, these predictions, they swirled around your birth, but each one of them actually shows us who you are and who you came to serve and who you came to set free. So Lord, I thank you that you come not just accepting the broken, but you come from the broken. And there's no piece of us, whether in the past, in the present, or in the future, that you're not ready to tackle, that you're not ready to heal. Lord, you're ready for all of it. So God, right now I pray that you would do unexpected things in unexpected people. That you would help us to discover the righteous and holy life that we're meant to live. God, I pray we would break the chain, that we would start something new, that today would be a birthday of sorts for a new breed of us. We're not chained to the past. Instead, we're chasing the future. Lord, don't let us leave today if we have a chain weighting us to the past. Don't let us leave today until we deal with it. Don't let us hide from it. Don't let us say tomorrow. Instead, let us tackle it head on. Because it's what you came to do. And it's what you help us do. Lord, I can't wait to see what new beginnings start in this Christmas season in these families. We thank you for new beginnings. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, we're going to have a prayer team up front today. If you have those chains to the background that you're stuck with, they would love to help counsel and pray and care for you in that meantime. Otherwise, we can't wait to see you back next week for Foretold number 2. Yep, we'll see you next week for number 2.